All right. Hello, everybody. It's Alan, and we're going to go over today books of 2023, everything that I read from January 1st until now, and roughly the order that I read them. So this is the long version of this. If you guys want a short version, I will be posting that on my Instagram, I think. But yeah, let's just jump right into it. I'll be giving a rough summary of every book that I've read, and then from there I'll maybe give them a rough rating based on how much I liked it and if I could recommend it to people or not. So the first book that I read this year was actually an audiobook that was free on Audible to all Audible account havers. Caffeine by Michael Pollan is a short listen on Audible, only around 2 hours. A very fun one that also comes free with any Audible subscription. They touch on topics like caffeine history, the health effects of having a caffeine addiction, which is pretty interesting for someone who has relatively a considerable caffeine addiction. I'd give it a 7 out of 10. I mean, if you have 2 hours, you go on a long drive, you have a bit of time in between classes, I wouldn't mind listening to this one again, actually. And I believe it's exclusive on caffeine or on Audible as well. So would recommend it. If you have an Amazon account, I think you get a free trial or something like that. Highly recommend. There will be a mixture of physical and non-physical books on this list, by the way. So for the first one is The Crystal Shard by R.A. Salvatore. This book comes from the Legend of Drizzt series. I first read the Dark Elf trilogy in 2022, and I liked it very, very much. It's been a while since I read any fiction, so it was a good book for me to pick up on. This book, however, the first part of the trilogy, I fell asleep trying to read this book. The prequel trilogies, like I said, where Drizzt Do'Urden escapes from his home city in the dark caverns of the Underdark and Menzoberranzan, were way more interesting and really makes the most out of Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms setting. Although I like Icewind Dale setting in the actual D&D modules, the setting felt a little plain in this book. Hopefully next year I'll be able to pick up this series again, since I know that R.A. Salvatore has a lot of other good trilogies for Drizzt. Drizzt being a Mary Sue-esque character in this series also got really old after reading the Dark Elf trilogy last year. Honestly, this might be the lowest rating I've given any book, so 2 out of 10. Next is Liminal Thinking by Dove Gray. I also listened to this book on audiobook while it was available. I don't have that much to say about this book because it's a very thought-heavy book. I think it's a good book on how to deal with both the past and future by changing the way you think now. I think that is the best way I can summarize it, because it does delve into a lot of topics, and I don't want to try to surmise and kind of dumb down those Gray's different writings. I would give it a 7 out of 10. If you have time, if you're interested in something like that, I would recommend it. Next is No Fears, No Excuses by Larry Smith, also listened to on Audible. This is a great book for college students like me who are contemplating their future, and I think reading a book like this admittedly is a little redundant since I already hold a lot of these same viewpoints that Smith does in their book, but it was nice to reaffirm those beliefs. I would highly recommend this book to people who are finding a way to settle in their careers or people who are currently unsure of theirs. I'd give it like a 8 out of 10. Next is The Ethical Slut by Janet W. Hardy and Dossie Easton. The Ethical Slut was my first literary book on queerness, sexual orientation, and relationships. This isn't my usual genre, admittedly, but a multitude of my friends have read this book and personally recommended it to me. The Ethical Slut touches on primarily the practical application of polyamory or general non-monogamy. Some readers have also dubbed it as the quote poly Bible, and to be honest, I have some mixed feelings on this book. Although it does work well as a primer to the polyamorous world in both pure definition and mindset, in my opinion, other longtime non-monogamists have claimed that this book is severely outdated. It also prescribes a certain amount of actions as purely ethical versus non-ethical, which brings up an entirely new conversation about morals in itself. Through other generally queer or non-monogamist people, I've been prescribed to read into other relationships books on this topic, such as More Than Two by Eve Rickert and Franklin I'm not going to try to pronounce that, or Rewriting Rules by Meg John Barker. I'm going to hold off on giving this book a rating since I feel like there's a lot more for me to learn before I can assign a numerical judgment on a book on a topic that I'm especially less knowledgeable in. Remember, kids, education before judgment. I'll either update my rating in the comments or we'll touch on this book next year. The Mistborn Trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. So far, my favorite fantasy trilogy that I've ever read. Every book was as captivating as the last. Mistborn was my first introduction into the Brandon Sanderson verse, and oh boy, was it good. I could do a whole video on just Sanderson and his writing, but if you want to get into fantasy or are already a fantasy fan, I would highly recommend this series. So the first book, Mistborn, The Final Empire, is great. It pulls you in with like a heist-like team of characters and sets the stage for this weird alternate planet where they have cool magic, cool fights, interesting characters, different perspectives on things, a lot of mystery, a lot of things that are uncovered that just draws you in and makes you want to read even more. The Well of Ascension was kind of like the Avengers Affinity Wars to this series. A lot happens that builds up the suspense and rising action for the trilogy. It mainly sets up the third book, but it also has its own sets of twists and turns. I would say The Final Empire is a 10 out of 10, and this book would be more like an 8 out of 10. The Hero of Ages, the third book of the trilogy, represents the trademark Sanderson avalanche perfectly. Across the 1,700 pages of the entire trilogy, Sanderson drops tiny hints and breadcrumbs that eventually all coalesce and connect into this final crescendo of a finale. Amazing. It had my heart racing at every page flip, and there's a whole other trilogy after this one. 10 out of 10. The series overall, 10 out of 10. It's great. I would skip classes to read this book instead. It's amazing. For quite a shift, I would say, in tone, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. Published in 1532, the infamous Machiavelli wrote his book as an instruction manual for a relative as a guide to ruling over Florence, Italy. I'm not the most well-versed or educated person when it comes to political ideology, but it was an interesting read to understand a more extremist, almost moral utilitarian perspective as to how to be a ruler. The book was translated from Italian to English, so I do feel like a lot of the prose that made The Prince an interesting read in the first place was lost. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. I also listened to this on Audible. This book was originally recommended to me by my high school research and seminar teacher. Hi, Mr. Shortalk. But I never finished it because of senioritis. Regardless, it was a very quick read. Only 72 pages, but it's a pretty concise step-by-step manual on how to prevent, tyranny. Snyder, being a historian specialized in the Holocaust, easily identifies the key factors to the rise of totalitarianism in Europe. I would definitely recommend this book since it's so short. It's like you could finish it in an hour, one sitting. Also, what's pretty funny about this book is that if you take all of his steps and on how to prevent tyranny, and you do the exact opposite, you have a step-by-step guide on how to become a tyrant. 9 out of 10. I liked it. Secret Warfare, The Battles of Codes and Ciphers by Bruce Norman. I picked up this little used book in a cute little bookstore named Verbatim Books in San Diego. A book about codes and ciphers and how they're used in warfare. My namesake Alan Turing would be proud. This is definitely a personal bias of mine, but delving into the cryptology of how information and messages were encrypted and traveled over long distances during World War II was quite the enjoyable read. If you're into war history or cryptology, this is a must pick up. 8 out of 10. Next is Make Time by Jake Knapp and John Zeratsky. I will admit this is a reread. I originally read this book in, I think, around quarantine, around 2020. This past school semester and arguably summer, I've been pretty strapped for time. It was becoming relatively difficult for me to find time for myself since it seemed like every single second I could squeeze out in between school, research, and commuting was immediately soaked up by my exhaustion. Luckily, I always have this wonderful book to fall back on, one that gives a systematic approach to improving your workflow and being able to give yourself the most out of your 24 hours each day. That you can spend less time feeling like you don't have enough time and more time actually doing what you want to work on every single day. This is a reread, so I technically shouldn't give it a rating, but 9 out of 10. All right, next is She Comes First by Dr. Ian Kerner. This book is about giving oral sex to women / people with vaginas. The first half explains the context of why partners should give their female partners oral sex and how to get into the correct mindset of doing so, while also dispelling any myths of the vagina that men may have through various reasons. The second half explains how you, well, do it, complete with step-by-step instructions, tips, and diagrams. Listen, I can't exactly advocate as to whether or not this book works or not. I wouldn't be the one to ask anyways, but hey y'all, it doesn't hurt to try. It's also pretty funny, so I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Next is Sandworm by Andy Greenberg. I won't say too much about this book for reasons unrelated due to a project that I'm currently working on, but I love this book. It's a great dive into Russian hacker unit 74455, otherwise known as Sandworm. The book follows a history of a hacking group and unveils many of the several methods that the hacking group draw upon throughout history. It's also especially relevant since they were also involved in the current Ukrainian invasion this year. 7 out of 10. The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. I picked up this book after stopping by a bookstore / coffee shop with my girlfriend since the relatively plain cover caught my eye. It's honestly alright. It is a lot of pages and pretty expensive given the actual contents of the book. A lot of pages have very minimal text and even less meaningful insight as to how to be creative. I don't necessarily disagree with Rubin's claims and writing, but it's just that there are other books that are more concise and straightforward with their delivery. If you want to learn how to be creative, don't read this book. If you want motivation and encouragement as to how to be creative, sure, 5 out of 10. The last and final book for this year is Austin Kleon's Show Your Work. This book is a reread and was the first thing I picked up after winter break started. I love this book. It truly demystifies certain aspects of the creative process and never fails to reinvigorate my desire to create. There isn't much I can say about this book other than that you should read it yourself. 10 out of 10. Well, that's it for my 2023 books summarized. Thank you guys so much for checking this out. I very much appreciate it. If you have any questions about any books that I've read, or if you want any more specific recommendations from books that I've read in previous years, feel free to let me know. All right. See you guys next year. Bye-bye.